Good afternoon, class. In this case, we're going to talk about the grammar of Spanglish. First of all, we're going to refute the charges of linguistic incompetence by analyzing the amount of factors that demonstrate the children's knowledge of Spanish and English grammar. The first topic is honoring the syntactic hierarchy. Spanish, English bilinguals, young and old and from diverse Latino backgrounds, demonstrate a shared knowledge of rules about appropriate boundary sides of Spanish-English language that distinguishes their code switching. Spanish, English bilinguals do not favor switches between the pronoun and auxiliary, or between auxiliary and infinitive, or omit personal aid or indirect objects as required in Spanish sentence. In the Lipsky study, we can see that in the third column shows that the children of the stupid switch at similar points three categories: sentence, noun, and object noun phrase. Clauses, like independent and subordinate, with and without conjunctions, appear within the top 10 categories of all three sets of data. Only tags and prepositional phrases differ strongly, perhaps due to differences in data collection methods. Here we have an excerpt as an example, and we can say that switches that cross syntactic boundaries or broke into a constituent, for example, the Skylab es una cosa que está rodeando el moon, taking pictures of it, were coded in accordance with the grammatical form of the largest constituent at the switch initial boundary, Spanish perfect and English noun in the example. Then we have the Spanish and English constituents. Switches occur in both languages, in every category and subcategory of constituents. The leading role of sentences and clauses in English, like 52%, and Spanish, 48%, is evidence of the children's ability to produce major constituents in both languages. 3 of the 5 constituents that were switched in English more than Spanish were single words, like tags, adjectives, predicate, adjectives, 63 to 70% of which were in English. Single words also predominate in 5 of the 9 that favor Spanish: determiners, fillers, hesitations, prepositions, conjunctions, and pronouns. Children never spoke in one for very long without acknowledging and incorporating the other, especially in informal speech. Now we have grammar and informal speech. Following Labov, a narrative is an account of a personal experience in the past that includes at least 2 sequential clauses. It may include an introductory abstract, an orientation, actions in the story, evaluations, a resolution, and a concluding coda. Labov's description of the narrative as the type of speech which is monitored the least implies that bilingual would generate more code switches in narratives than in any other genre. Narratives and conversations were similar in respect to the variety and type of constituent switch, except that narratives include more than 3 times as many clause switches as full sentences. Like in this example, Ellie and Lolita switch complete sentences in casual conversations at more than twice their rate in narratives. Only 6% of Lolita's and 4% of Ellie's switch in narratives were full sentences. A similar pattern appeared in the switching of US-born Puerto Rican teens in Brentwood. They pronounced significantly more clause switches than community members who were born in Puerto Rico.
Now that we have seen El Bloque's data, we can corroborate the Sankoff-Poplack hierarchy and constraints. Children switch utterances 94.7 complied with the equivalence constraint that is the grammatical rules in standard or non-standard of each language, which were honored by the constituent of both sides of the switch boundary. Now we can identify 9% of all switches which were obeyed on a non-standard dialect. For example, we have "Man, you cheap," where there is 0 copula. In errors, we have "poniste" instead of "pusiste." We got unique forms like "what you did that" instead of "why did you do that," or even "what did you do that for." Bound morpheme constraints except for "mediodía" instead of "mediodía." which separate the different themes of a compound noun. Something to consider is that in Spanish, normally we require determiner noun adjective. For example, una camisa roja, a shirt red. And in English, we demand determiner adjective noun, as in a red shirt. Most of the switches that contradict the Spanish word order were nouns, as in the tall maestra. And the 43% of the switches which contradicted English word order were adjectives, as in las cosas scary, the scary things. Finally, transfers impose one language's way of saying or meaning onto the other language. For example, she started telling mira pipí, look pee, then mimics the Spanish use of the same verb decía for saying and telling. Another example is put me this one follows the verb indirect object direct object order of ponme este instead of put this one on me. Now, linking language constituents grammatically and development patterns. There are 3 investigations in quantitative comparison. But first, I'm going to talk to you about 2 criteria that pointed out in the switches favored in children, like language dominant and age-related tendencies. Now first, we have the topic, the language linked to particular constituents. The selection of Spanish or English reflected the speaker's language dominance often lead to age. The accuracy of children's self-evaluation of bilingual proficiency was confirmed by the language they choose for the syntactic constituents. They switched most often. For example, we have Lolita and Ellie, 2 girls who evaluated their English as better than their Spanish, switched into English more than their friends did for various grammatical categories. Full sentences and subordinate clauses. Would have favored Spanish in group total if Lolita and Ellie had been excluded. But we have examples as the determiners and the prepositions. We have to note that they did not always prefer English. For object noun phrases, they chose Spanish. Every child switched at least one constituent. We have, for example, Isabel, Spanish dominant, who preferred English for both object and subject noun phrases. She produced the greatest number of Spanish switches in the miscellaneous and adverbial phrase categories, yet stood alone in her preference for English conjunctions and imperatives. Another girl, called Paca, joined her in producing most of her subjects, which is in English. Blanca, another girl, performed like the younger Spanish-dominant children in opting for more Spanish switches overall, but her object noun phrase switches manifested the highest proportion of English choices. Now we go frequent and infrequent switches. All the girls switched at similar grammatical boundaries and with similar frequency. Lolita switches for Spanish objects that she did not know in English because they came up infrequently outside of the home or their block. For example, seno, as in breast, coco pelao, as in baldy bean, tornillo, as in screw. More were common nouns that she did know in English, like camiseta, t-shirt, or peseta, quarter, sala, living room. But they too were closely linked with home and her Spanish-speaking parents. Sometimes she inserted the English version in the Spanish sentences. In the case of Ellie, she tended to be in Spanish like Lolita, but they were less childlike. For example, demonio, devil, or moreno, as in black man, psiquiatra, as in psychiatrist. These words appear in narrative more than in casual conversations. Switching like Ellie's boundaries low on the syntactic hierarchy of major studies of Spanish-English switching can be interpreted as reflecting ignorance of the grammatical constraints, since it is the kind of switching reminiscent of second language learners. Right, Mario? Yes. Pay attention. Now that we have Mario's attention, now we can continue. Standards, constraints, and transfers. Differences in adherence to the constraints put an individual stamp on speaker styles. Lolita. She produces 43% of the switches that they manifested interference or negative transfer, and in her language switches, the transfer of Spanish prepositions was obvious. For example, imitating the Spanish preposition en to mean add, in, on, and even by. For example, she was crying on the funeral. I like the muñequita on black. You'll find out in the end of school. English influence on Lolita's Spanish was apparent when she incorporated the English possessive s in. El baby de papi's amigo es así. My father's friend's baby is like that. This was a natural extension of use of Spanish family titles and otherwise English sentences, as in papi's book, which means fathers, or my titi's house, which is considered as aunts. And it did away with the repeated de preposition that Spanish requires, as in another example, el baby del amigo de papi.
Thank you. Now we're going to talk about syntactic constraints. There were 5 grammatical categories that predominated switches between English and Spanish, like full sentences, noun and phrases, and independent clauses. One study even suggested that the size of the constituent determines its likelihood of being switched, with larger constituents favored over smaller ones. Nonetheless, there was evidence against this conclusion that pointed out that switching happens because of the similarities between English and Spanish grammatical structures and syntax. Now that is clear, we can move on with the importance of Chicano and Puerto Rican bilinguals. They can switch between segments of rule-governed Spanish and rule-governed English by mapping similar parts of the two grammars onto each other. A switch may not occur between a bound morpheme and a lexical form unless the latter has been morphologically and phonetically integrated into the language of the bound morpheme. Now, if you didn't understand the thing that I just said like me, you're probably wondering what I just said, but this might help you. I think that all of us have heard that song even once in our lives, and there we can find an example of code switching with the word jangueando. So with this we can say that we can form the word jangueando, which comes from hanging out, but we cannot form viving, to live, or viving. That's not possible. Now, another analysis relies on the insertion of other languages into the matrix languages, where the grammar of the matrix language or languages govern the sentence. The linguistic competence of fluent bilinguals include the abstract features, morphological, semantic, syntactic, that mark each item in the lexicons. Now we can move on to the evolution of PACA's code switching, which was an analysis experiment of a girl named Paca and her code switching. So now maybe some of you want to participate. So I'm going to choose Mario and Anthony. You can either be Paca or the other person, so you can decide. For helping us. Now we have that the result of this was the beginning of Paca's code switching, and this was only when she was 6 years old. Now, 2 months after that, we have the second dialogue that Paca made, including code switching. So here I'm not going to choose, you are going to just participate if you want. You can either be Paca's mom, Paca, or A, so you can decide whoever wants to participate. Thank you very much. Now here we can see how Paca exploited her code switching in more varied ways. Here Paca learned to switch to full sentences, independent clauses, subordinated clauses with and without conjunctions, an object-noun phrase, and adverbial phrases. So, the results of these experiments were that Paca's code switching intensified, and from just inserting few quotations, she started to imitate the code switching of older fluent bilinguals, and her English improved at the expense of her Spanish. Nonetheless, she got confused with some phrases and words, like the baby of Vicky, when she wanted to say Vicky's baby. And every day, she got confused with todo el día, which is very common to happen when you try to code switch, so it is completely normal. Now, the development of Baca's code switching included the three stages represented by the three generations of PR immigrants. The first is those who immigrated as adults. The second one is those brought to the US as preschoolers, and the third are the US-born teens. So here we also have that Paca demonstrated a progressive loss of Spanish as she went from inserting obligatory switches from English quotations to more purposeful and optional switches, culminating in a mix of optional and obligatory switches for Spanish lexical gaps. And she also became an English dominant with simplified Spanish. Now to finish, we have the conclusion. As a conclusion, we have that code switching may be seen as part of an alternative form of resistance, not a deliberate ignorance of multicultural realities, but a different and potentially more democratic way of apprehending them. The code switching of El Bloque's children proved that they were not semi or alingual hodgepodgers, but adept bilingual jugglers, just like this picture. Code switching involves language ability with a type and number of grammatical constituents that are switched in ways that are of interest to those who seek measures of bilingual proficiency, but reliance on isolated code switches or deviations from standard rules results in a distorted picture of a bilingual's competence. Growing up bilingual can result in a cross-cultural intersection, just like the New York Puerto Rican, with a unique aspect of communication. Decisive factors had less to do with the acquisition of grammar and more with the desire of kids' parents to raise them bilingually. Thank you very much for your attention, and just to finish, we have a short video, a song, which might help you to understand this topic even more. We hope to enjoy it. Te vas a tener que navegar, parecía